So you might just be looking at what could be the best monitor of 2024, which is Corsair's new Xeneon 34-inch 240Hz OLED monitor. Now, it might also be a matter of preference if this is the best monitor of 2024, since all the hype is usually around the new 4K OLED that came out earlier this year, but as somebody who still has a soft spot for ultra-wide monitors, this might be my new favorite or just something I'm really pumped about. For reference though, I've been maining two 4K 240Hz OLEDs on the daily between LG's dual mode Beast with a built-in speaker and Gigabyte's QD OLED option with a built-in hub and DisplayPort 2.1. With that, why is this monitor still special? Well, for me at least, I haven't really used a 34-inch ultra-wide monitor in about 2 years, and the fact is, there hasn't really been anything that compares much in terms of feature sets that you'd find on the beastly 4K OLEDs. This one in particular though does match that 240Hz refresh rate, and it's only a slight 1800R curve versus the aggressive 800R curve you find on something like the Asus or LG. And sure, while that's definitely awesome, I think I prefer the more subtle 1800R curve. Apart from that, this monitor does have a built-in KVM hub with an insane amount of ports, which makes this an incredibly versatile monitor when it comes down to any sort of gaming, media, and productivity. With all of that, this is pretty much an endgame monitor for most people based off of the spec sheet alone. Quickly, as for what you're getting in the box with this monitor, you are getting a stand base, which is pretty sturdy, the power cable, a DisplayPort cable, an HDMI cable, a Type-C to Type-A cable for the KVM, as well as a Type-C to C cable for your display. And pretty much out of the box, you've got just about every cable you need to get this setup going. As for the specs, coming in with a resolution of 3440 by 1440p, you're getting a super sharp image at about 110 ppi, which is plenty sharp for both gaming and productivity. And of course, while that won't quite match up in terms of pixel density to a 4K monitor, this really is an incredible option for a lot of people out there. Pairing that with a 240Hz refresh rate and a 0.03 millisecond response time, this is easily an insane option when it comes down to any sort of gaming, which I'll definitely be touching on. At a 21:9 aspect ratio on a 34-inch QD OLED panel, the image quality on here will be near unmatched regardless of what you're doing. Not to mention you've got an insane amount of ports on here, which makes this incredibly versatile for just about any desk setup. On one side, you do have two HDMI 2.1 ports, one DisplayPort 1.4, as well as a USB Type-C with display support with charging up to 65 watts. They also split more ports on the other side, which gives you yet another Type-C with 15 watts charging, which also acts as the cable that connects the hub to your other inputs. There's also 4 USB-A's in that hub with KVM support, and something I'm super glad to see here is a 3.5mm audio jack, since there are no built-in speakers. One thing to note as well when it comes down to this monitor is that the power supply is built in, meaning you don't have to do any sort of cable management or anything for a big brick, and I absolutely love that. As for what's in my setup and all these ports and stuff, I've got the PlayStation 5 set up through one of the 2 HDMI ports, my RTX 4090 rig on the DisplayPort, and either my work laptop or MacBook through the 65-watt Type-C port. On the other side of things, I do have that upstream Type-C cable going to my PC for that KVM switch, which has the hub hooked up to my mouse, keyboard, light bar, and headset. And lastly, I've got the Kanto U4 speakers, which are my absolute favorite, and these are going through that headphone jack. And overall, it's kind of crazy how much you can have connected to this single monitor. And with that as well, from a built-in aesthetic standpoint, this monitor is absolutely gorgeous and it's built incredibly well. Bezels do go nearly edge to edge with a small chin that has some Corsair branding on it. I would have loved to see this be chinless like LG's recent monitor, but they seem to be the only ones doing this right now, just a tiny nitpick. And this will fit into just about any desk setup from an aesthetic standpoint. This is my first white monitor I've ever had, but honestly that's not really something I'm going to see anyways. The back end here is actually pretty thick, which houses all the internals for this monitor, but the panel itself is actually crazy thin, which is still wild to see. There are VESA holes here you can use to mount the monitor on an arm if you prefer that, since the included stand is actually pretty large. It's definitely hefty and built super well, but it does take up a decent amount of space on your desk. But for me, again, I'm going to be testing out both of these. I think I'm leaning towards the monitor arm, but let me know what you guys think. Still, if you are cool with the stand, it definitely is functional and gets the job done. It does have both height and swivel adjustments, but there won't be any sort of rotation, not that you'd really want to do that on an ultrawide anyways. But apart from that, there is a hole here as well for any sort of cable management. And the last thing you'll really see on here is the knob on the bottom side, which is super accessible, so I appreciate the location of this. An extra nice touch here from Corsair as well is that there is a proximity sensor, so if you ever do raise your hand here and you're looking for the location of these buttons, it does have an on-screen pop-up so you know where to press. It's the small things like this that really do make me appreciate this monitor. And something I also appreciate is simply how incredible this display looks, which is actually the 3rd generation of QD OLED coming out from Samsung. If you're unfamiliar with an OLED panel, pretty much each individual pixel has the ability to turn on and off, resulting in literal real blacks in super punchy colors. By comparison, an LCD display can't really give you full true blacks, which is why OLED panels have become a fan favorite for monitors, phones, tablets, and TVs. There also seems to be a massive debate between WOLED, QD-OLED, glossy or matte finishes when it comes down to displays, and while there are some valid arguments between either or any of them, in truth it really does just come down to your preference. And while I've previously found myself more indifferent for any of these panels at all, from a third generation standpoint on this QD-OLED, the fact is this display is going to get brighter, it's more energy efficient, and even more color accurate compared to any other type of OLED, plus the glossy finishes have slowly started to grow on me. This is VESA HDR certified with an absolute 3% peak brightness of about 1000 nits and 97% DCI P3 color coverage. When it comes down to 3% HDR, I sort of find that metric useless, but there is more to this HDR which I'm going to get to. In reality though, I don't personally test HDR brightnesses nor calibrate any of my displays, but in person I can say this display looks insanely good, and I can appreciate it is factory calibrated. From a gaming standpoint as well, this monitor does support both AMD FreeSync and NVIDIA G-Sync, which will cover you for just about any system you might be running. With that, there's absolutely zero tearing on my RTX 4090 PC, since all the GPU frames are synced up with this monitor, and so far it's been an incredible gaming experience. From a personal gaming standpoint though, I've always sort of preferred the 21:9 aspect ratio, although 16:9 is obviously the default for 4K panels, alongside competitive gaming. With that, I really did miss the look and feel of gaming on an ultrawide, and again, I really do appreciate the 1800 arc curve is super subtle, but awesome from an immersion standpoint, and again, it just looks great in just about any desk setup. From an FPS standpoint, of course, ultrawide isn't the best option like I mentioned, but this monitor still pulls heavy weight with its 240Hz refresh rate and 0.3 millisecond response time. Pretty much with that, unless you're some sort of anime protagonist, that's pretty much imperceptible, making everything near instant on this monitor, and throwing down any FPS game on here is going to be a good time. For me, my go-to is still Overwatch, and it did take me some time to get used to 21:9 again, but I was still clapping all the cheeks after about 2 rounds. Either way, depending on what sort of game you're playing on this monitor, you can always just force 16:9 in-game if you prefer to, but if you aren't jumping into any sort of FPS games, you will definitely see more benefit from this wide panel in other games like Red Dead Redemption 2 or Diablo 4, which are some of my all-time favorite games. The OLED panel on here simply makes everything look absolutely gorgeous, and I'm considering making this my main display going forward, despite not being 4K I've been used to. And sure, this monitor is definitely geared toward the PC gamer, but those HDMI 2.1 ports lend incredibly well to the Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5, since you will be getting the full console features on here. Recently, I've been playing my PS5 more than my gaming PC, and while the PlayStation 5 doesn't support ultra-wide resolutions, and I doubt the PS5 Pro will, I can still force this back to a 16:9 aspect ratio in the menus and play at a normal 1440p resolution like needed. And as mentioned, HDMI 2.1 is going to give you all those awesome PC-only features like ALLM and VRR, which makes this an incredible option for console gaming as well. Of course, the PlayStation 5 will only push 120Hz tops, but it's no less awesome for me at least, since just about any game on here still looks incredible. I have been making my way through Last of Us Part 2, which is an absolutely beautiful game, especially on an HDR display like this. Outside of that, I really do still prefer games like Call of Duty or X-Defiant on a console, which do take full advantage of those competitive features I mentioned. But overall, whether it's PC or console, everything on here is incredibly smooth, and this really is a great monitor for gaming. And considering you can swap around the aspect ratio depending on your system, it's almost like you have 2 monitors in one, which is absolutely badass. But what I can definitely say is that an ultra-wide monitor like this definitely shines outside of gaming as well, since the wide display makes this an awesome option when it comes down to any sort of productive work. And what used to be an issue on OLED panels was shitty text clarity, which is far from an issue on here, and doing any sort of accounting work during my day job, I've had absolutely zero issues. When doing any sort of creative work as well, this monitor has been a great option for editing my timelines, since it is a 34-inch wide panel, and it's worked better than I anticipated. From a creative standpoint, I frequently edit videos on an Apple Studio display, which does have a peak brightness of 600 nits, and this actually gets brighter than that, which is great when it comes down to any sort of colors and stuff. I also like to use the factory calibrated preset on this monitor, which I'm going to touch on when I get to the menus. But honestly, from a work standpoint, overall it's been great. There's plenty of room here when it comes down to windows depending on what you're working on, and it's hard not to appreciate it. Again, I don't really measure this stuff, but a quick Google shows me this monitor has a peak 250 nits in SDR and 620 nits in HDR, so yeah, it definitely looks good for a normie like myself. Outside of that, as an OLED panel, any sort of content and media on here will look good, and so far I kinda gotta go searching for something not to like. As for what's in the menus, you do have quite a bit here, but I will just name out some key features I personally really like. The first one obviously are probably the picture settings, which you can change around depending on what you like. For me, I'm either using the HDR peak brightness for everyday stuff or media, the gaming preset, which is self-explanatory, and then there's the creative preset here again, which is the factory calibrated color profile, which I love to use for my content creation. And since this is an ultra wide monitor, there is one feature I absolutely love, which is going to be picture by picture or picture in picture. This works extraordinarily well on an ultra wide and allows me to throw up two inputs side by side perfectly, or otherwise I can always use a small window. I like to throw shows up on one side and gaming on the other, which is always great for a single monitor setup. Then of course you might be worried about burn-in on an OLED panel, but there is a screen life management section here where you will find all the settings that will help you prevent it. You got a panel refresh option here which takes about 6 minutes, which helps prevent any sort of image retention and burn-in. And then you have orbit, which is pretty much a pixel shifting setting that moves your image in a circular motion by 1 pixel every minute, so no single pixels in the same spot forever. Then lastly, there's the brightness stabilizer. This pretty much just nerfs your max brightness down to 250 nits, which I'm not particularly interested in using personally, but it is there if you need it. Either way, you've got a 3-year warranty for burn-in from Corsair, which is the new industry standard, which is always a good thing. Apart from that, there are some tiny features here you might be interested in, like the crosshairs or showcasing your FPS, and other visual settings like gamma. Now, as for everything I've talked about with this monitor, the question is, who is it even for? In all honesty, in my research as of making this video, no other brand has really made this monitor with this many ports. I think Gigabyte and MSI released this same panel in their monitors, but I do think those have less features. As for who this is for still, my first thought goes to anybody really looking to get back into ultra-wide monitors like myself, since I can easily say this is the best one I've ever used so far. A lot of the other ultra-wide options are pretty big as well, coming in at 39 or 45 inches, which also have that aggressive 800R curve. And while I've used those in the past, I do think this specific monitor and size is a little bit more manageable and seems to fit well in more situations. Of course, this is primarily a gaming monitor as well, so for anybody who really wants a versatile gaming monitor that can easily jump between tasks like media or gaming, this is an easy choice. Likewise, for anybody who just doesn't have a GPU to push high refresh at 4K or are totally content at 1440p, that is where this monitor becomes an endgame choice, since I don't really see where you can go from here, especially with this feature set. With that, the main downside is simply how expensive this monitor is, coming in at $1,200. In the grand scheme of things though, for a monitor of this feature set, I can imagine a cheaper price point would probably see some cutbacks, which I'm not sure would be worth it. And honestly, if I were to truly nitpick this monitor, the single thing I would want to see from this monitor would be a built-in speaker like LG's 4K OLED. That monitor single-handedly changed what I thought was possible when it comes down to built-in monitor speakers, and I wish every display had that. But what do you guys think about this monitor? Is it worth the price tag? Let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. Consider liking and subscribing if you made it this far. I appreciate you watching till the end. Till next time.